Of all the things that impact a person's life, few ever consider philosophy to be of any importance. But as much as it is neglected, it plays a pivotal role in a person's life. One's philosophy can make the difference between being happy or being in hell. Historically, bad philosophies are most known for when they are the foundation of political movements, such as the ethnic nationalism of the Nazis or the egalitarianism of the Khmer Rouge. However, philosophy can just as dramatically shape the course of an individual's life. Subjectivism declares your delusions as reality, setting the mental state of a schizophrenic as the ideal, whereas nihilism declares your life as meaningless. Whether you act to keep living or if you act towards self-destruction, it is considered morally the same. To the degree of one's adherence, a person's philosophy dictates the path they follow in life, which is why understanding philosophy is worthwhile. So what exactly is philosophy? To put it simply, it's the abstracted study of a field of knowledge. For ethics in particular, it's the question of what is good or bad for a person. For example, what is your policy for lying? Sometimes or never? How about your policy for deciding what is true or not? Scientific or how it makes you feel? How about your ability to decide your own fate? Is it in your hands or are you destined to behave a certain way? The philosophy of ethics is just an abstraction of all these types of particular questions into an integrated set of policies in which you live by. There are many people who consider themselves to not have a philosophy, as they've never thought about the question. However, as one goes through their life, they end up hashing together those policies into their de facto philosophy. This constitutes everyone that hasn't explicitly adopted a philosophy, as no one can go through their life without any sort of policy on what they should or shouldn't do. Philosophy plays a central role in a person's life, whether they know it or not, by setting the standard of what good or bad is in one's life. An improper philosophy can reverse this, causing one to strive for self-destruction and scorn the good. Universal Preferable Behaviors, or UPB for short, is a philosophical approach to ethics. It is a modern philosophical idea originated by Stefan Molyneux, an intellectual and social commentator who published the ideas as a book, Universally Preferable Behavior, in 2007. UPB starts with the premise that it is an undeniable fact, in other words an axiom, that some things are preferable to others, that even the argument, there are things that are not preferable to others, is self-defeating, because the act of argument shows that you prefer to make this argument, demonstrating that you consider this preferable to not making this argument. This can be described as the axiom of preference, and provides the foundation for UPB. The next link in UPB's chain of reasoning is that, due to the fact that we know that some actions are preferable, we simply need to discover which ones are universally true. For a moral to be universally true, it has to be true at all times and places. For example, theft cannot be a moral virtue because a person cannot engage in theft in every place or all the time. A moral must be universalized in order for it to be valid. This leads into the next conclusion of what qualifies as ethically good for UPB. The only things that can be universalized are prohibitions against certain actions, essentially negative ethics. So in all cases and at all times, actions such as theft or murder are considered immoral. Consequently, the only criteria for being moral is the avoidance of such immoral actions. Hence why this is a negative ethics. In contrast, seeking positive virtues is considered an impossibility, because there are no morally positive actions which you can engage in universally. UPB considers itself a methodology to discover what is ethical. It comes to the conclusion that ethics such as the non-aggression principle is moral, as it considers it as being capable of being universalized. When I first heard about this approach to ethics, I found it incredibly compelling. Between its axiom of preference and its logical approach to determine what is universally moral, I became temporarily convinced that this position was the correct one, and I'm not alone. After all, did you, dear viewer, personally see a good counter to this chain of reasoning? However, this rather benign-sounding approach to ethics has a terrifying endpoint. The political system it advocates is the so-called anarcho-capitalism, a system where all contemporary governments are abolished and individuals must defend themselves personally or privately contract security agencies in the absence of rule of law. If you cannot personally do this, then your life and safety are forfeit. However, this isn't even the worst of it. Stefan Molyneux has found that UPB is completely compatible with ethnic nationalism. Stefan himself has personally been advocating for a form of white nationalism. It seems that in the lawless future, people still need some base common denominator for groups in the formation of defensive packs. And what could be more basic than a person's skin color? So we can look forward to rampant racial conflict in addition to everything else. The contrast between the seemingly harmless position and the complete disaster you end up with is what is interesting here. Breaking this down can bring us a long way in understanding how to avoid creating this sort of mess for ourselves. So let's talk about the deficits of UPB. The axiom of preference is not a sufficient metaphysical basis for an ethical system. It is true that the axiom of preference is correct in the aspect that preferences must exist, but this axiom does have premises that are left unstated and are not taken into consideration when formulating UPB. This axiom can be interpreted in any way without further metaphysical support that reality exists, that a consciousness exists, and that entities must have their own particular identities. The only way to establish these premises is with further axiomatic proofs. As I've previously stated, an axiom is a proof that has to be valid in all circumstances, even in the case where a person is arguing against the axiom, as it is still implicitly accepted. In the philosophy of objectivism, which I will return to later, there are three fundamental axioms. The axiom of existence, that existence exists. The axiom of consciousness, that consciousness is conscious. And the axiom of identity, that identity of an entity is that entity. Essentially, A is A. I can exemplify this with the axiom of existence. To make any argument, you first must presume that something exists. Even the act of stating that nothing exists is the making of an argument, a conceptualization, and an act of communication, which completely negates the claim of the argument. This same type of self-refutation repeats for all the arguments against the other axioms, but I will not bore you by repeating myself. To re-examine the axiom of preference, besides the unstated reliance on the axiom of existence, it is underpinned by the two axioms. It requires the establishment of consciousness to be valid, as well as the understanding of identity. In order to acknowledge any conclusions we come to on a preference's nature, one must have a consciousness to be able to comprehend the world around them in order to have preferences. The identity of entities must be accepted in order to consider such preferences to be achievable. After all, if you cannot project what will happen, then you can't prefer anything. Without these axioms, every part of the axiom of preference breaks down. Existence must exist for the preferable to exist. Consciousness must be conscious for there to be any awareness of the preferable. Identity must exist for the preferable to be possible. My position is that these axioms are more fundamental than the axiom of preference and is the base of metaphysics, which serves as the foundation for the successive branches of philosophy, including ethical systems such as UPB. UPB explicitly does not give advice on what to do, only on what to avoid doing, such as assault or aggression in general. This would be negative ethics, the identification of evil, as opposed to seeking positive virtues, which is the morally good. Stefan Molyneux gives the example of a sleeping man as a standard of judgment for negative ethics, as a person cannot be evil while asleep. But this also demonstrates the counterpoint, that you can only be as virtuous as a man who sleeps under UPB. The reason why UPB cannot prescribe any positive virtues to aim at is because it does not have any context for why anything is preferable. We need to properly identify man's nature in order to understand some things are preferable to others. Man is an organism whose means of consciousness is reason. An organism requires certain criteria in order to survive. These are values such as food and shelter. And reason is a faculty that conceptualizes the information which man has to use to decide which actions to pursue to achieve his goals. proper context of UPB's axiom of preference is that the identity of man is as an organism which must achieve values to survive, and as a being which means of consciousness is reason, which he must use to conceptualize values as preferences and choose one over the other. With this context, the axiom of preference becomes an acknowledgement that each of man's actions concerns the value it has to his life. It could serve as a springboard in searching for values to pursue. With the identification of man's nature, you can strive for positive virtues, such as happiness or courage. The purpose of the philosophy of ethics is to provide guidance in one's life to achieve the good and to avoid evil. In this, UPB fails by its own admission in its denouncement of positive virtues as even being possible. Let's take a look at the political application of UPB, of anarchy. If we account for the identity of man as an organism whose means of consciousness is reason, we can see that it would be consistent to delegate his self-defense to a government. The nature of man allows us to see that it is ethical to delegate the use of violence to a third party, as long as it has rational standards for the preservation of man's life. UPB advocates for anarchy, as it supposedly is the only way to universalize non-aggression politically. The chain of reasoning is that if it is immoral to utilize violence, then it is immoral to delegate it and plan for its use. It would be immoral to design a government to protect one's life, but it is moral to defend oneself once you're under attack. If the link from the premise and the conclusion sounds arbitrary and disconnected, that's because it is. You can honestly take UPB and change the conclusion so it advocates for a total pacifism or a total despotic tyranny and have it make just as much sense. After all, you can't always use self-defense, but you can always be helpless or always be oppressed. The point is that it provides no context of the nature of man to take into account, resulting in all sorts of absurdities being compatible with UPB. This is the cause of the nonsense of ethnic nationalism that has sprung out of Stefan Molyneux. It is both perfectly compatible with UPB and seen as the natural byproduct of anarchy, where groups of people huddle together for mutual defense, and skin color acts as the basic common denominator between these people. I am coming from this from the perspective of a person learning philosophy, particularly the one formulated by Ayn Rand called objectivism. This is the primary source of my understanding of metaphysics and the nature of man. It's where any follow-up should begin. It's very likely that I've misapplied some aspects of objectivism, so if there is any discrepancy or misunderstanding, the fault is mine. I hope I've successfully illustrated why philosophy is so important. It can make the difference between sleepwalking into anarchy to having a proper government. It can make the difference between being capable of achieving the good as opposed to simply avoiding the bad. UPB is an excellent example of why you should check your philosophical premises and validate them. The unwillingness to examine your life will result in real consequences to your well-being given enough time. As for a constructive conclusion, I hope you observe that throughout this examination of UPB, we've come to examine the nature of man and found that his means in which to achieve his values is reason. When confronted with a problem, such as this, the solution is to reason your way through, to the best of your ability until the issue is resolved. You can naturally come to many conclusions of a proper philosophy by methodologically applying reason to the problems you encounter. However, if you would like to take a shortcut, I would suggest you look into objectivism. Alright, that's a wrap.